They labeled it the Sperrvaren, the scout car. That was a grave misjudgment. On the frosty morning of December 18, 1944, close to the Belgian hamlet of Stavelo, a procession of German half-tracks advanced through the fading night. Within the lead SDKFZ 251, Oberfeldwebel Klaus Meyer peered ahead through the vehicle's exposed roof. His detachment had been on the move since the stroke of midnight, part of Kampfgruppe Piper's spearhead, pushing deep into American defenses during what would later be known as the Battle of the Bulge. These half-tracks, manufactured by Hanomag, were robust machines that had previously transported German infantry across the vastness of Russia, through the North African deserts, and across France in 1940. Their frontal armor, 8 millimeters thick, offered protection against rifle fire and shell fragments. While open-topped, this design facilitated rapid disembarkation and provided superior situational awareness compared to a fully enclosed vehicle. Meyer placed his trust in his half-track. It had served him faithfully through 3 years of conflict. Then he saw it, a low, angular silhouette obstructing the intersection ahead. 6 wheels, not tracks, and a turret bearing what appeared to be a diminutive cannon. An American armored car, the very type the intelligence reports had described as an M8 Greyhound reconnaissance vehicle, lightly armed, swift, but vulnerable. The kind of machine that typically retreated when confronted by substantial combat power. Meyer's gunner already had the MG-42 machine gun trained on the American vehicle. The half-track commander quickly assessed the situation. The armored car was isolated. His own column comprised 3 half-tracks, with a Panzer IV tank following somewhere behind in the convoy. If the American crew possessed any semblance of good judgment, they would reverse and vanish before the German contingent could close the distance. If you're finding value in this detailed exploration of events, please consider subscribing and sharing your location with us in the comments below. The Greyhound remained stationary. Its turret rotated deliberately, the barrel of its cannon swinging to bear on the lead half-track. Meyer witnessed the muzzle flash. He heard the sharp retort of a small-caliber gun firing, followed by an immediate impact. A 37 millimeter armor-piercing round struck the frontal plate of the SDKFZ 251 at a range of approximately 200 meters. The 8 millimeters of armor, designed to deflect small arms fire and shrapnel, offered virtually no resistance. The projectile punched through cleanly, traversing the crew compartment at a velocity exceeding 2,000 feet per second. Meyer never comprehended his demise. The round impacted the radio equipment positioned behind the driver, disintegrating into numerous fragments of shrapnel that tore through the confined interior. The driver slumped forward. The vehicle glided to a halt, its engine still running, effectively blocking the thoroughfare. The second half-track in the procession attempted to maneuver around the disabled lead vehicle. The Greyhound's turret swiveled once more. Another shot, another penetration. This round struck the half-track's side armor, a mere 6 millimeters thick. It pierced both sides of the vehicle, entering on the left and exiting on the right, slicing through the crew compartment in between. By the time the third half-track reversed and the column dispersed in search of cover, 2 German vehicles lay immobilized, and 11 men were either dead or injured. The American armored car, its commander having successfully executed his orders, smoothly reversed and disappeared down a side lane. Its crew had expended just 4 rounds. The surviving Germans would spend the remainder of that frigid December morning grappling with the incomprehensible events. They had been informed that American armored cars were merely reconnaissance units, scouts, observers. They had been told these wheeled vehicles shied away from direct confrontation, that their armor was thin and their armament light, suitable only for screening and reporting enemy movements. No one had adequately conveyed that a scout car's cannon possessed the destructive capability to neutralize a half-track. The SDKFZ 251 half-track was not a product of haphazard design. It was the culmination of meticulous military planning that originated in the mid-1930s, a period when German strategists recognized the imperative for infantry to maintain pace with mechanized tank formations. Conventional infantry advanced at a pedestrian pace, approximately 3 miles per hour. Motorized infantry transported in trucks could achieve speeds of 30 miles per hour on roadways, but trucks, with their unarmored exteriors, were susceptible to small arms fire, offering no protection and rendering them unsuitable for deployment in active combat zones. The solution lay in the armored half-track, a vehicle that merged the road speed of a truck with sufficient armor to shield its occupants from rifle fire and artillery fragmentation. Hanomag, a prominent German engineering firm based in Hanover, secured the development contract in 1937. The specifications were precise. The vehicle was to transport 10 infantrymen alongside a two-person crew, and its armor was to withstand rifle-caliber projectiles and the concussive force of near artillery misses. An open top was mandated to allow mounted infantry to fire their weapons and to disembark rapidly upon reaching their objective. The design incorporated a hybrid track and wheel system, with front wheels for directional control and rear tracks for off-road maneuverability. What German intelligence failed to accurately ascertain was the potential for a 37mm cannon to penetrate the armor of an SDKFZ 251 half-track. The calculations were straightforward, yet seemingly overlooked. The half-track's frontal plate measured 8mm thick. 37mm armor-piercing rounds were capable of penetrating 36mm of armor at a range of 500 yards. The cannon possessed 4 times the penetration power necessary to overcome the half-track's strongest armor. At typical engagement distances of less than 500 meters, the M8's gun could pierce the half-track's armor as if it were merely sheet metal. The rounds would penetrate cleanly, slicing through the crew compartment, and either exit through the opposite side or fragment internally, transforming the vehicle's interior into a lethal death trap. The open top, which German doctrine considered an advantage for rapid infantry deployment, became a critical vulnerability when engaging an adversary capable of firing into the crew compartment from angles that would bypass the thin side armor. By December 1944, as Kampfgruppe Peiper's half-tracks advanced into Belgium during the initial stages of the Battle of the Bulge, thousands of M8 Greyhounds were actively engaged across Western Europe. They had proven themselves as effective reconnaissance vehicles, fast and dependable. Their crews had gained an intimate understanding of the vehicle's strengths and limitations through months of combat. Conversely, the German troops in the half-tracks had acquired no practical knowledge of the Greyhound's lethality against their own vehicles. They continued to perceive the M8 as a mere scout car, lightly armed and posing no threat to armored fighting vehicles. The morning of December 18th would irrevocably alter that perception. The M8 Greyhound that blockaded the road at Stavelot on that December morning belonged to Troop B, 8th Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, part of the 7th Armored Division. The vehicle had been in active service since August 1944, arriving in France shortly after the breakout from Normandy. Its crew had served together for 5 months, ample time to develop an intimate familiarity with their vehicle's capabilities. Staff Sergeant Robert Harper commanded the vehicle. He was 24 years old, hailing from Michigan, and a former automobile mechanic who had enlisted in 1942. His training at Fort Riley, Kansas, had been rigorous and highly practical, encompassing 6 weeks of instruction in cavalry tactics, vehicle maintenance, radio communication protocols, and gunnery. The Army's doctrine instructed reconnaissance crews to view their armored cars as mobile observation posts rather than dedicated combat vehicles. However, the training also underscored that when combat became unavoidable, the 37mm gun was a legitimate and potent weapon. Harper's gunner, Corporal James Mitchell, had discharged hundreds of practice rounds during his training. He possessed a thorough understanding of the M6 gun's ballistics, knew how to accurately estimate range, and was proficient in selecting the appropriate ammunition for various targets: armor-piercing shot for vehicles, high-explosive rounds for infantry and soft targets, and canister shot for close-quarters defense against infantry assaults. With a skilled crew, the gun could achieve a firing rate of 15 to 20 rounds per minute. The turret housed 16 ready rounds in their racks, with an additional 44 rounds stored within the hull. The ammunition itself was straightforward yet highly effective. The armor-piercing shot, designated APC, armor-piercing capped, weighed 1.61 pounds. The projectile featured a hardened steel core engineered to penetrate armor plate. Upon impact, the round would continue through the target, fragmenting as it traveled. The cap on the projectile's nose facilitated its ability to engage armor effectively, preventing ricochet at angled impacts. At the factory in St. Paul, each M8 underwent stringent testing prior to acceptance. The armor plates were meticulously inspected for any imperfections. The engine was run for extended periods on test stands. The transmission was cycled through all gears repeatedly. The suspension system was subjected to rigorous trials on rough terrain courses designed to simulate combat conditions. The main armament was bore-sighted and test-fired. Only vehicles successfully passing every inspection were approved for military service. By December 1944, the 87th Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron had received its full complement of M8 Greyhounds, numbering approximately 54 vehicles organized into 3 reconnaissance troops and 1 assault gun troop. Each reconnaissance troop consisted of 3 platoons, with each platoon operating 3 armored cars. The vehicles typically operated in pairs to provide mutual support, enabling one vehicle to observe while the other advanced. The squadron's primary mission during the Battle of the Bulge was to screen the flanks of the 7th Armored Division and provide early warning of German troop movements. On the morning of December 18th, Troop B was positioned to secure the road approaches south of Stavelot. Harper's crew had occupied their post before dawn, observing the road through the dim light of early morning. German reconnaissance units had noted the presence of American armored cars in the vicinity. Kampfgruppe Piper's intelligence officer had been briefed on standard American reconnaissance practices. The Americans employed wheeled armored cars for screening operations, typically withdrawing when they encountered significant enemy resistance. The intelligence assessment characterized these vehicles as possessing light armor and armament, suitable for observation, but not for sustained combat engagement. Reports mentioned 37mm guns, but deemed them ineffective against armored vehicles. This assessment was based on the 37mm gun's performance against formidable German tanks and assault guns, such as the Panzer IV with its 80mm frontal armor, or the Panther with its 100mm frontal armor. Even the Stugge III assault gun boasted 80mm of armor on its superstructure front. Against such heavily armored adversaries, a 37mm gun was virtually useless, its rounds bouncing off harmlessly at any range. The critical oversight in the intelligence assessment was its failure to consider the 37mm gun's effectiveness against lighter armored targets. The SDKF Z-251 half-track, with its 8mm frontal armor and 6mm side armor, fell well within the effective penetration envelope of the 37mm armor-piercing round. At ranges under 1,000 yards, the gun could penetrate the half-track from any angle. At ranges under 500 yards, the rounds would significantly overmatch the armor, punching through with considerable residual energy. The ballistic data unequivocally supported this conclusion. At a range of 200 meters, the 37mm APC round retained a velocity of approximately 2,600 feet per second. At this velocity, the round was capable of penetrating 48mm of homogeneous armor plate. The 8mm armor of the half-track represented less than 1/5 of the gun's penetration capability at that range. The round would pass through as readily as a rifle bullet through plywood. Inside the half-track, the crew compartment measured approximately 4 meters in length, 1.8 meters in width, and 1.5 meters in height at its highest point. When a 37mm round penetrated the front armor, it had 4 meters of space to traverse before exiting the rear. Occupying this confined space were up to 12 men, the driver, the vehicle commander, and 10 infantry passengers. The round would strike the first solid obstruction in its path, fragmenting into numerous pieces of shrapnel, each piece traveling at lethal velocity. There was no internal armor, no protective plating, and nothing to impede the fragments from ricocheting multiple times throughout the crew compartment. German half-track crews had received no specific training for such a scenario. Their established vehicle doctrine dictated that upon encountering enemy armor or anti-tank guns, they were to dismount their infantry and withdraw while heavier German armor engaged the threat. The half-track was essentially a troop transport, not a dedicated combat vehicle. It was never intended to be placed in a position where enemy guns could engage it directly. However, reconnaissance doctrine sometimes positioned half-tracks in precisely these vulnerable situations. German mechanized reconnaissance units utilized half-tracks to rapidly transport infantry along roadways, probing for enemy positions. Upon making contact, the established doctrine prescribed that the infantry would dismount to develop the situation, while the half-tracks provided covering fire with their machine guns. If enemy armor appeared, the half-tracks were to withdraw while the reconnaissance infantry called for anti-tank support. This doctrine proved effective when the enemy adhered to predictable patterns. If American armored cars withdrew upon encountering German forces, as intelligence suggested they would, then the half-tracks remained relatively safe. However, if an American armored car chose to engage, if its commander determined that his 37mm gun could effectively engage the German vehicles, then the doctrine collapsed with catastrophic consequences. Harper's training at Fort Riley had included comprehensive target identification protocols. He had been instructed to recognize German vehicles by their silhouettes: trucks, half-tracks, armored cars, tanks, and assault guns. He was acutely aware that half-tracks were lightly armored vehicles, their protection designed to stop small arms fire, but nothing more substantial. He had been explicitly informed during his training that his 37mm gun possessed the capability to penetrate half-track armor at combat ranges. As he observed the German column approaching in the pre-dawn gloom, Harper executed a rapid tactical assessment. 3 half-tracks advancing in a column formation. No tanks were visible in the immediate vicinity. The range was approximately 200 meters. The lead vehicle was exposed on the roadway with no available cover. His own vehicle occupied a hull-down position, providing excellent fields of fire and a clear withdrawal route should it become necessary. The decision to engage took perhaps 3 seconds. Mitchell had already aligned the gun on the lead vehicle. Harper issued the fire command. The breech of the 37mm gun was loaded with an armor-piercing round. Mitchell depressed the trigger. The gun recoiled, the spent shell casing was ejected, and Harper watched through his periscope as the tracer element of the round arced towards its target. The impact was visible even in the dim morning light, a flash of sparks where the round struck the half-track's frontal armor. The vehicle's forward momentum ceased abruptly. Through his vision blocks, Harper could ascertain that the vehicle was immobilized. There was no smoke yet, but it was clearly out of commission. Mitchell was already preparing to load the second round. The turret traverse motor whirred as Harper adjusted the aim to the second vehicle in the column. The German driver was attempting to maneuver around the disabled lead vehicle. Mitchell fired again, this time striking the side armor. Harper observed the round's tracer continuing through the vehicle, exiting on the opposite side. The second half-track slewed to a halt, its driver either deceased or incapacitated. The third half-track in Kampfgruppe Piper's column began to reverse frantically, its driver shifting the vehicle into reverse and backing away from the intersection. Unteroffizier Hans Weber, commanding the third vehicle, had watched in utter disbelief as both vehicles ahead of him were struck and immobilized within seconds of each other. His training had not prepared him for such an event. American scout cars were expected to retreat, not to stand and fight. They were reconnaissance vehicles, not tank destroyers. Weber shouted orders to his driver to get off the road and seek cover. The half-track veered onto a side street, the driver wrestling with the steering wheel to navigate backward while peering through his small rear vision port. The vehicle lurched over the curb, its tracks churning up dirt and debris. Weber's machine gunner was attempting to identify the source of the fire, traversing the MG-42 back and forth, but in the dim morning light, with only muzzle flashes to indicate the target's location, he could not acquire a lock. At the intersection, Harper ordered Mitchell to cease firing. The third vehicle had withdrawn out of sight. Engaging it would further expose their position and potentially draw fire from other German vehicles in the vicinity. Harper's mission was reconnaissance and screening, not prolonged combat engagement. He had achieved the immediate objective of preventing the German column from utilizing this road. Now he needed to report and withdraw before German reinforcements arrived. The radio operator contacted the troop command post, reporting contact with German armored vehicles. 3 half-tracks engaged, 2 disabled, 1 withdrawn. The transmission took less than 30 seconds. Harper ordered his driver to back the Greyhound out of its position and proceed to their alternate location, 300 meters to the south. The vehicle's engine responded smoothly, the 6 wheels providing excellent traction as they reversed down the narrow street. Behind them, German infantry were dismounting from vehicles further back in the column. Weber's half-track crew was attempting to extricate wounded personnel from the 2 disabled vehicles. What they discovered was devastating. The first half-track, struck in its frontal armor, had the round entered just above the driver's position. The armor-piercing shot had punched through cleanly, traveled the entire length of the crew compartment, struck the radio equipment, and fragmented. The driver was dead, killed instantly when fragments impacted his back. The vehicle commander was also dead, caught by fragments that ricocheted through the cramped interior. 3 of the 10 infantry passengers in the rear compartment were dead. 4 more were wounded, some critically. The situation in the second half-track was even more dire. The 37mm round had struck the side armor at an almost perpendicular angle, penetrating at a point just behind the driver's compartment. The round traveled through the crew area, passed directly through 2 men, and exited through the opposite side armor. 5 men were dead, and 3 were wounded. The vehicle commander was attempting to organize medical assistance for the wounded, while simultaneously Oberleutnant Friedrich Steiner, the platoon commander, arrived at the scene within minutes. He had been riding in a half-track further back in the column and had heard the engagement. The sight that greeted him was profoundly shocking. 2 vehicles disabled, 8 men dead, 7 wounded, with clean holes punched through their armor. The entry wounds were approximately 37mm in diameter, clearly indicating the caliber of the round that had created them. An American armored car, armed with a 37mm gun, had inflicted this damage. Steiner had been engaged in combat since 1941. He had fought on the Eastern Front, where Soviet anti-tank rifles and 45mm guns had repeatedly penetrated half-tracks. He had lost vehicles in France to American bazookas and to tank fire, but those were specifically designed anti-tank weapons. This situation was different. This was an armored car, a reconnaissance vehicle, something that German intelligence had characterized as lightly armed and posing no threat to armored vehicles. He meticulously examined the penetration holes. The armor had been completely defeated. There was no evidence of glancing blows or partial penetration. The rounds had passed straight through. At this range, approximately 200 meters, based on the survivors' accounts of the American vehicle's position, the 37mm gun possessed more than sufficient power to defeat 8mm of armor. The mathematics were undeniable. Steiner immediately realized that every half-track in the column was vulnerable to these weapons. The intelligence briefings had been inaccurate, or more precisely, incomplete. While American armored cars were equipped with 37mm guns that were ineffective against German tanks, those same guns were highly lethal against half-tracks, other armored cars, light reconnaissance vehicles, and any other target with armor less than 30mm thick. At typical combat ranges, American reconnaissance vehicles could effectively destroy German reconnaissance vehicles. Weber, the commander who had survived by retreating, reported to Steiner. The vibrations from the impacts on the vehicles ahead had reached them. They'd glimpsed the muzzle flashes originating from the American position. Weber's initial thought was that they were facing a direct assault from an anti-tank weapon or a tank destroyer. It wasn't until he had retreated slightly and gained a broader view that the realization dawned. It was an armored car. The psychological shock was immediate and profound. If armored cars possessed the capability to neutralize half-tracks, then crews operating half-tracks were perpetually at risk whenever they encountered American reconnaissance forces. German combat dispatches from that particular day conveyed a palpable sense of bewilderment and apprehension. The War Diary of Camp Group. A piper documented an engagement near Stavelot, noting the destruction of 2 half-tracks by enemy ordnance. The initial report attributed the attack to anti-tank artillery. Subsequent reports, compiled after debriefing survivors and examining the damaged vehicles, revised this assessment to attribute the damage to armored cars. One report specifically highlighted that American reconnaissance vehicles were equipped with cannons capable of piercing half-track armor at typical engagement distances. This intelligence was not novel to German military planners. The specifications for the M8 Greyhound were well documented, as were the capabilities of its 37mm cannon. What had been lacking was the crucial analytical step of determining if these weapons posed a genuine threat to German armored vehicles. The prevailing assumption was that 37mm cannons were outdated anti-tank armaments and therefore not a significant danger. Apparently, no one had contemplated the possibility that weapons deemed obsolete for anti-tank warfare might still be entirely effective against half-tracks. American after-action summaries from the same engagement were notably concise and factual. Staff Sergeant Harper submitted his combat report on December 19th, detailing how his crew had engaged 3 enemy half-tracks at approximately 3:30 in the morning, achieving 2 successful penetrations and forcing 1 vehicle to retreat. The report estimated between 8 and 10 enemy combatant fatalities. Harper noted that his own vehicle sustained no damage and had repositioned as directed. The entire encounter lasted less than 2 minutes. For Harper and his team, the engagement served as a confirmation of their training. The 37mm cannon could indeed overcome light armor. Half-tracks constituted light armor. Consequently, the cannon was capable of defeating half-tracks. The reasoning was clear and direct. Mitchell, the gunner, reported that both projectiles he fired were direct hits, estimating the range at 200 yards. Both rounds penetrated their target. The cannon performed precisely as anticipated. If you find this narrative compelling, please consider subscribing and enabling notifications. Your support is invaluable in allowing us to continue producing in-depth content of this nature. The psychological chasm between the two opposing sides was stark. German crews discovered their vehicles were susceptible to weaponry they had previously not considered threatening. American crews verified that their armaments functioned as designed against appropriate targets. One side experienced a jolt of surprise and revelation. The other side felt a sense of affirmation and bolstered confidence. Word of the Stavelot clash rippled through Camp Grouper Piper in the subsequent days. Other units reported comparable encounters. In proximity to Stunt, a platoon of half-tracks confronted 2 M8 Greyhounds obstructing a crucial intersection. The American vehicles initiated fire from concealed positions at an approximate range of 300 meters. 3 half-tracks were struck before the column could disengage and request tank support. By the time a Panzer IV arrived to neutralize the American threat, the Greyhounds had already withdrawn. An additional 7 German soldiers had lost their lives, and 5 sustained injuries. Near Tappens, a reconnaissance patrol operating half-tracks encountered an American cavalry screen. The Americans had strategically positioned numerous armored cars to control access to a bridge. As the German half-tracks advanced, 3 M8s unleashed fire simultaneously from distinct locations. The resulting crossfire proved devastating. 4 half-tracks were hit within the initial 30 seconds of engagement. The surviving vehicles withdrew under a smoke screen, abandoning their attempt to secure the bridge. The engagement concluded in under 5 minutes. 14 German soldiers perished, and 9 were wounded. Each of these encounters followed a similar pattern. German half-tracks approached an American defensive line. American armored cars engaged from protected vantage points at distances ranging from 200 to 500 meters. The 37mm cannons cleanly pierced the half-track armor. The half-tracks, unable to effectively retaliate with their machine guns and unwilling to close to point-blank range where their infantry could engage, withdrew and called for heavier armament support. By the time tanks or assault guns arrived on the scene, the American armored cars had already relocated to alternate positions. Within 3 days of the commencement of the German offensive, half-track commanders across the attacking formations recognized a significant threat posed by American reconnaissance vehicles. Directives were issued down to battalion and regimental levels. Half-tracks were explicitly forbidden from engaging American armored cars without the presence of tank support. Reconnaissance patrols that encountered M8s were instructed to report the contact and withdraw, rather than attempting to press the engagement. This marked a fundamental alteration in German tactical doctrine. Half-tracks had historically served as aggressive reconnaissance and infantry transport vehicles, expected to advance rapidly and identify enemy positions through direct contact. Now, they were being ordered to avoid engagement with one of the most ubiquitous vehicles in the American infantry arsenal. Nearly every American reconnaissance unit, cavalry squadron, and mechanized cavalry troop was outfitted with M8 Greyhounds. There were thousands of these vehicles deployed across the Western Front. The tactical ramifications were substantial. German reconnaissance operations became characterized by increased caution and hesitation. Half-track patrols that would have previously advanced assertively to locate American positions now held back when they suspected enemy reconnaissance vehicles were in the vicinity. This inhibited the German operational tempo and provided American forces with more time to pinpoint German movements and formulate responses. German commanders acknowledged the emerging problem with alacrity. Obersturmbannführer Jan Piper, commanding the Kampfgruppe bearing his name, noted in his combat journal that American armored cars were proving unexpectedly formidable against his reconnaissance elements. He requested additional tank support for his forward units, but tanks were critically needed for the primary assault and could not be diverted for escort duties with half-tracks. The solution that some German units adopted was to lead reconnaissance patrols with a tank or assault gun, with half-tracks following closely behind. This arrangement provided the necessary firepower to effectively engage American armored cars. A Panzer IV's 75mm cannon or a Stu G3's 75mm cannon could neutralize an M8 at any combat range. The American vehicle's half-inch frontal armor offered no protection against these weapons. However, this workaround introduced its own set of complications. Tanks were slower than half-tracks on roadways, thereby diminishing the speed of reconnaissance operations. Tanks consumed considerably more fuel than half-tracks, placing further strain on already stretched logistical chains. Furthermore, tanks were essential for the main offensive thrusts and were not available for escorting reconnaissance vehicles. Every tank assigned to escort duty represented a tank unavailable for the spearhead of the attack. Some German units experimented with deploying armored cars for reconnaissance instead of half-tracks. The ZKF Zetter's 232 eight-wheeled armored car, equipped with 20mm cannons and possessing superior armor compared to the half-track, was a rare asset, with only limited numbers in service. The majority of reconnaissance units continued to rely on half-tracks for their mobility and troop-carrying capacity. The impact on German infantry morale was subtle, yet undeniable. The Panzer Grenadiers who rode in the half-tracks had placed their trust in these vehicles to shield them from small arms fire during their approach to battle. They now understood that American reconnaissance vehicles could easily penetrate their armor. The psychological comfort derived from traveling in an armored vehicle vanished. While the half-track still offered advantages over dismounted movement or transport in unarmored trucks, it was no longer the secure, mobile stronghold it had previously appeared to be. American reconnaissance units, meanwhile, experienced a surge in confidence. The word spread rapidly through cavalry squadrons and reconnaissance battalions. Your 37mm cannon can destroy half-tracks. Crew after crew reported successful engagements. The M8's reputation evolved from that of a mere scout car to a credible combatant when necessary. Commanders became more inclined to order their armored cars to stand their ground and fight when the tactical circumstances warranted such action. Training doctrine within the United States was updated to reflect the experiences gained in combat. New crews arriving in Europe were explicitly instructed that their 37mm cannons were effective against German half-tracks, armored cars, and other lightly armored vehicles. Gunnery practice included exercises simulating engagements against targets representing half-tracks at various distances. The message was unequivocal. You are not defenseless when encountering German light armor. The implications for American industry and vehicle design were equally significant. The M8 had been conceptualized as a reconnaissance vehicle, with its cannon primarily intended for self-defense against enemy reconnaissance units. Combat experience validated the soundness of its design. The 37mm cannon, though outdated for anti-tank combat, was perfectly suited for its designated role. The vehicle's speed enabled it to dictate the terms of engagement. Its armor provided adequate protection against small arms fire and shrapnel, while maintaining a weight low enough for exceptional mobility. German planners reviewing the combat reports recognized a fundamental miscalculation in their strategic planning. They had designed the half-track's armor to withstand the threats anticipated on the battlefield of the late 1930s: rifles, machine guns, and artillery fragments. They had failed to adequately consider the danger posed by light anti-tank weapons or by cannons in the 37 to 45mm range. By the time this deficiency became evident in combat, it was too late to redesign the vehicle. Germany's industrial capacity was fully committed to existing production lines, and the introduction of a new half-track design would have caused production delays spanning several months. The narrative of the M8 Greyhound and the ST Kfz 251 half-track was preserved in official combat dispatches, unit histories, and post-war interviews with participants. American cavalry units recorded their engagements in a straightforward manner, noting targets engaged and ammunition expended. German units reported their losses and sought tactical guidance on how to counter the emerging threat. Military historians from both sides eventually compiled these records into comprehensive analyses of reconnaissance operations during the Second World War. The United States Army Armor School at Fort Knox, Kentucky, undertook in-depth studies of cavalry operations in Europe following the war. These studies meticulously examined hundreds of engagements involving M8 Greyhounds, analyzing the efficacy of various tactics and equipment. The conclusion drawn was that the M8 had proven highly effective in fulfilling its intended role. The vehicle offered excellent reconnaissance capabilities, possessed sufficient firepower to engage enemy light armor, and was reliable enough for extended operations far from supply depots. The 37mm cannon, while obsolete for engaging medium and heavy tanks, was perfectly adequate for its purpose against reconnaissance vehicles, half-tracks, and light defensive structures. These studies subsequently influenced post-war armored car design. The M38 Wolfhound, which succeeded the Greyhound in the 1950s, retained many of the M8's design characteristics while incorporating lessons learned from wartime combat. The new vehicle was larger, featured enhanced armor protection, and was armed with a 76mm cannon. However, the fundamental concept remained consistent: a swift, wheeled reconnaissance vehicle equipped with adequate firepower to overcome light opposition. German military historians, conducting their own post-war assessments, arrived at differing conclusions. The half-track had been a successful design for its originally intended purpose, but that purpose had been defined in the late 1930s based on the threats Germany anticipated facing. By 1944, the nature of the battlefield had evolved in ways that rendered the half-track increasingly vulnerable. The German army had recognized this during the war and had endeavored to develop more adequately protected vehicles, but resource limitations and production priorities meant these improved designs never saw significant deployment on the front lines. The Federal Republic of Germany, in the process of rebuilding its military in the 1950s as a member of NATO, opted against developing new half-tracks. Instead, they adopted fully tracked armored personnel carriers, boasting thicker armor and enclosed crew compartments. The M113, an American-designed vehicle that became standard across NATO, featured aluminum armor up to 38mm thick on its frontal arc, offering double the protection of its wartime half-track predecessor. The lessons learned during the Second World War directly informed this decision. Mechanized infantry units required superior protection compared to what half-tracks could provide for the veterans who had served in those vehicles. The memories remained remarkably vivid for decades after the conflict. Oberst, a German half-track commander who had survived the Stavelot engagement, immigrated to Canada after the war and seldom discussed his combat experiences. However, in a 1982 interview with a military historian, he described December 18, 1944, as the pivotal day when he understood that Germany's defeat was inevitable. This realization stemmed not from the destruction of two half-tracks, but from what those destroyed vehicles symbolized. American forces possessed equipment that functioned reliably and in seemingly inexhaustible quantities, operated by well-trained and confident crews. German forces were making do with increasingly inadequate equipment in insufficient numbers to replace losses, operated by crews who were keenly aware of being outmatched. Harper, the American armored car commander, returned to Michigan after the war and resumed his career as an automobile mechanic. He owned a service station in Detroit for 35 years. His Bronze Star citation was displayed on his office wall, yet he rarely spoke of it with his patrons. In a 1976 newspaper interview commemorating the Battle of the Bulge, he characterized the December engagement with simple brevity. "We had a good vehicle, good training, and good equipment. We did our job. That's all there was to it." Mitchell, Harper's gunner, became a secondary school teacher in Ohio. He taught history and occasionally referenced his wartime service when discussing the Second World War with his students. His accounts of combat were clinical and devoid of overt emotion. He had sighted the cannon, discharged the weapon, and struck the target. The training had been effective. The equipment had functioned as intended. The outcome was precisely what any competent crew should have achieved under those circumstances. The contrast in perspectives between the German and American veterans was striking. German survivors recalled the shock, the disbelief, and the dawning realization that their equipment was insufficient. American veterans remembered confirming the tenets of their training, validating their preparedness, and accomplishing their mission with tools that performed as advertised. One side experienced profound revelation and eventual defeat. The other side experienced reassuring validation and sustained confidence. The broader historical significance of these engagements lies not in their immediate tactical impact, which was relatively minor, but in what they revealed about industrial warfare between modern nations. Victory in such conflicts hinges on industrial capacity, logistical systems, training infrastructure, and the ability to produce dependable equipment in quantities sufficient to equip entire armies. Individual weapon systems are less critical than the overarching system responsible for producing, delivering, maintaining, and deploying those weapons. The M8 Greyhound was not an exceptional vehicle by the standards of the Second World War. It was not the swiftest armored car, nor the most heavily armed, nor the most robustly protected, but it was sufficiently capable for its mission, reliable enough to remain operational, and manufactured in quantities large enough to equip all the reconnaissance units that required it. That was adequate. Perfection was not a prerequisite when sufficiency was available in overwhelming numbers. The CKFZ 251 half-track was also not a remarkable vehicle. It was adequate for the threats anticipated at the time of its design, but those threats evolved more rapidly than German industry could adapt. By the time its shortcomings became evident in combat, it was too late to redesign and retool production facilities. The vehicle remained in service not because it was optimal, but because there was no superior alternative available in sufficient quantities for replacement. The German soldiers who entered half-tracks knowing that American armored cars could destroy them faced a grim dilemma. They could refuse to execute their missions, which would entail abandoning their comrades and their duty, or they could continue to perform their missions, accepting the inherent risks posed by inadequate equipment. They chose to persevere, and many paid the ultimate price as a consequence. Their courage was genuine. Their professionalism was undeniable. However, courage and professionalism could not overcome 37mm armor-piercing rounds, traveling at 2,600 feet per second through 8mm of steel plate. The American crews engaging these German vehicles faced no such existential quandary. Their equipment functioned reliably, their training had prepared them, and their industrial base supported their efforts. They carried out their missions with the assurance that their tools were adequate for the task at hand. This psychological advantage, this confidence born from material superiority, was as significant as the actual material disparities. Soldiers who place their trust in their equipment fight with a different mindset than those who are aware of their equipment's deficiencies. When those initial rounds penetrated the half-track armor at Stavelot, they demonstrated a truth that would resonate through military planning for decades to come. In modern industrial warfare, material is paramount, as are production capacity, logistical systems, and the ability to sustain operations. No amount of tactical acumen, fighting spirit, or combat experience can compensate for fundamental material inadequacy when the disparity is substantial and prolonged. The German troops who referred to the M8 Greyhound as a scout car were not entirely mistaken based on the vehicle's designated role. However, they were catastrophically incorrect regarding its potential impact on their own vehicles. The 37mm gun they had dismissed as obsolete proved perfectly adequate for destroying half-tracks. By the time they learned this harsh lesson, thousands of German soldiers had already perished in vehicles whose armor could not shield them from weaponry that their enemy considered standard equipment for reconnaissance vehicles. This divergence between perception and reality, between the assessments of German intelligence and the experiences of German soldiers in battle, defined a significant portion of the late-war German military experience. Equipment that had seemed sufficient in 1939 was revealed as inadequate by 1944. Tactics that had proven effective against weaker adversaries faltered against the industrial might of the United States. Assumptions about American capabilities proved erroneous when tested in combat. For the historians who subsequently studied these engagements, the lesson was clear. Wars between industrial powers are won by the side possessing the greater capacity for production, supply, sustenance, and the rapid replacement of losses. Individual battles, individual weapon systems, and individual acts of bravery hold significance in the immediate moment. However, the cumulative weight of industrial capacity ultimately determines the outcome over time. The M8 Greyhound's destruction of German half-tracks was merely one small illustration of this overarching truth, playing out across countless battlefields in numerous countries over 6 years of global conflict. The men who fought in these vehicles on both sides grasped this truth, even if they could not articulate it in strategic terms. They understood what was effective and what was not. They knew which side possessed superior equipment, greater supplies, and more substantial industrial backing. They continued fighting because it was their duty, but they did so with a clear-eyed comprehension of the material realities that shaped their chances of survival. 70 years later, the M8 Greyhound is preserved in museums and private collections as a testament to American armored vehicles of the Second World War. The CKFZ-251 half-track also endures in museums, representing German mechanized warfare. Here, patrons have the opportunity to inspect both of these machines and witness firsthand the 37mm cannon, a weapon that demonstrated remarkable efficacy alongside the 8mm plating, which, by stark contrast, proved utterly insufficient. The fundamental calculations dictating the results of their engagements are immutable. The laws of physics are indifferent to valor, strategic approaches, or a nation's affiliation. A projectile fired from a 37mm weapon possessing adequate speed will invariably breach 8mm armor. This was an indisputable fact in December of 1944 and continues to hold true in the present day. We appreciate you joining us for this presentation. For more in-depth historical analyses, please direct your attention to the supplementary videos displayed on your screen at this moment. Additionally, remember to commit to our channel by subscribing.